was her name, and she came here probably in the 1890s. She was very, very elderly at the time. She was in poor health, and so she came to live with her daughter, Francilia, who was married to Dr. Luce. And while she was here, at the behest of her family, she wrote her memoirs. She couldn't write at that time, but she dictated them to her daughter, who wrote them all down. And I didn't get them out of the envelope, but I will. I'd like to just show you these, how very special they are. They're all handwritten. There's no date. I think it's early, just probably before the 1900s. 30 pages of handwritten notes that were taken by her as her mother dictated her life story to her. And they were given to, at some point, given to the Maquoketa Library. And I told Karen Manning how very happy I was that she was here today. The library had these for a very long time, and in I don't know how long. And
with the Boardman Library.
Okay, it would have been part of the Boardman Library. Okay. And then I believe in 1969, the library donated these to the Historical Society for safekeeping. And reading through them, they're so well written. They're wonderful to read. It's kind of like a whole season of Little House on the Prairie or something. But you know, they do no good just sitting in a file upstairs when nobody knows that they're here. And so that's why we're going to talk a little bit about them today. And it does, we made copies so we don't have to touch the originals, but if you ever want to see them, you should come and you should look at these because they're outstanding. So I just made this quick chart to help you put things in perspective because it's kind of hard to go back and forth here. But so as we go through this, I just like you maybe to keep in mind just a few things as we look at the recollections from her memories. We're kind of going to be talking about 3 generations of people, right? She writes about her mother Mary, okay? Well, this is Mary. She talks about her parents, and her parents were Elisha and Sally Thompson Branch. Well, he was born just after the Revolution. He was born in what, 1787, 1776? He was just, you know, right when our country was really, really brand new. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind as we go through some of the challenges and the hardships that they faced, okay? And then she grew up and she married, and she talks a little bit about her own family. So this is she and her husband Garrett. And as we were saying, it's interesting to me because she always refers to him in this writing as Mr. Spitzer. Just out of respect for him, it's Mr. Spitzer. And then we move into the 3rd generation, which is their daughter, Francilia, and her husband, David Luce. And that'll be the second part of the story that we talk about in 3 weeks. Okay, so again, thinking back to the very beginning of our nation, what would it have been like to have lived there, right? What values did these families have, and the great work ethic that they had to have, you know, just to survive. Their hopes for the future, the hardships that they endured. And most importantly, I think, that stands out is the passion that they had to see that their children got a good education. I mean, remember, at this time, there were no safety nets. I mean, you either did it or you starved kind of thing. There was no government handouts. There was no Medicare. Everything landed squarely on their shoulders, and they had to put their shoulder to the wheel to just have survival for their family. So I'm gonna, if I kind of go like this, okay? These are Mary's words, okay? It's 30 pages long, so I had to condense some of it into my words, but I want you to know what words are Mary's words. So, okay. The pages of this little pamphlet were written by Mary Branch Spitzer in her declining years at the bequest of her children. It was intended in no sense to be a literary effort, but rather to leave a record of the pioneer days in which she lived with its attendant struggles in a more permanent form. And then this is me. This was signed Francilia Spitzer Luce. But she begins her narrative this way, okay? in a little brown house, venerable for age, situated in Worthington, Hampshire County, Massachusetts. My father, Elijah Branch, was born April 9th, 1787. He was married October 3rd, 1810, to my mother, Sally Thompson, of Peru, Berkshire County, Massachusetts. And he took his bride home to care for his parents. His father, my grandfather Branch, I'm informed, was so crippled from rheumatism that for 17 years he had been unable to walk. Before my mother was married, she spun the flax and wove the linens, out of which she made all her underclothes, her sheets, and her pillowcases. Okay, so think of this. Before she was married, she did this. Would you or I maybe know how to do all of this? Well, I had to give myself a quick refresher course. I knew that flax was made into linen, and that's about what I knew. So just a quick thing, so you'll maybe understand a little better. This is a field of blue flax, okay? We'll just go through this quickly. But in trying to walk through Mary's shoes, I realized I wouldn't do very well. Found out that flax was grown for centuries and centuries. It was grown for its fiber because it was spun to make linen, and linen is known to be the oldest textile ever made by human mankind. There was linen before there was anything else in the way of fabric. It was, and it still is, raised, of course, for its oils and its seeds, which have health and medicinal benefits. And it's stronger and softer than cotton. So this is a field of flax that's just been harvested. Oh, I have trouble with this thing, I'm sorry. I did learn quickly that depending on what they were raising the flax for, depending on how closely they planted the rows in the field. If they were growing it for the seeds and that sort of thing, they spaced it out so it could grow into more bushes and that sort of thing. But if they were growing it to be made into linen, to be harvested and made into linen, they put the rows very close together. And that was so it would grow taller and more upright, and they would have long strands instead of little short bushy things. So that had a lot to do with it. But this is a field, and still there's a lot of flax grown in the world today. Okay, so trying to figure out what Mary would have had, what Mary's mother would have had to have done to make all these things that she made. I tried to figure out what went on. So first of all, they planted it and they harvested it, as you saw, and then they would have spread this flax out, this plant out, all over the grassy fields, and they leave it for 2 or 3 weeks. And during that time, a combination of the bacteria and the sun beating down on it, the rain and the dew is important. It would kind of start to soften and dissolve the stem materials that were covering this. So then after 2 or 3 weeks, that could begin to be separated, right? Now remember, Mary's mother is doing this all by hand, not like these men. Okay, so at this point, what we have is kind of like, we might think of straw today, right? Then the process that she had to do was called rippling. Rippling was when you picked up this material and you separated out the seeds. And then there was a final separation, and it was called breaking. And I think it was called breaking because it was back breaking. But they would have to have some kind of a wooden structure, and they would beat these long strands of what looked like straw. They would beat them and just kind of break them down. After they did this, there was a process called scutching. And scutching was a scraping operation which they took a hard piece of wood or something and they scraped down to remove some of this softened stuff that they were trying to get rid of, so that they just had the fibers in the middle left, right? So they did that. After that, what they had was called, they were trying to get the tow, T-O-W. So Mary's mother would take these long strands of flax. And so if you can imagine something that looked like a horse's tail, right? So you've got this long bundle, like a horse's tail. And she would then have to take that through a process called hackling. And these were things that they would have had to have made with steel fingers sticking up. And she would draw this horsetail kind of thing through this to clean it and to straighten it. So it would have to go through time after time after time. And as she did this, it would clean out some of the shorter pieces and get some of the other stuff out of there. So she just had the very long fibers that she was trying to get. So what resulted from this was called tow. So she would collect her tow, and with that she would make ticks for beds, for mattresses, or she would fill pillows or things like that. So then when she was done with that, she would take her long strands of flax, looking much like a horse's tail, and she would almost be ready to spin. Now I put this picture in because after a while they started factories where they would do the breaking process for people, so she could get that part of it done, but she still had to do all the rest. So after she got done pulling all these strands of things through these teeth, and she'd start out with teeth pretty far apart and then get finer and finer and finer, she would end up with a pile of fiber like that was then very soft and very pliable and ready to spin into linen. So she's already worked very hard, right? So then she would spin her strands into linen yarn. Then she would weave it into a fabric. She would have to make bolts of fabric, and then she would have to sew the fabric into garments, okay? So I brought over today from the other museum because I love this so much. This is one of our newest acquisitions. This is a flax spinning wheel. Thank you. I'm going to need lots of help today. Flax spinning wheel. And it's pretty amazing to me. This one we just got. It's smaller than most spinning wheels because it's for flax. And it is very old. It says 1810 on the side. We don't know. But it's very old. And because I have a very vivid imagination, this came from Jane Buckner's house that is being emptied by her son. And he's been donating a lot of treasures to us. Well, if you think back in your mind, the Buckner family, back in the early days of Makokata, very good friends with Dr. Luce and his family. Who knows? That may have been the very little flax wheel that we're talking about. Maybe not, but it may have been. I like to stretch things a bit. That's right. Thank you. Okay. So also I have brought, that came with this, because I didn't know what this looked like. I brought some flax that came, and I'm going to pass it around. Please be really careful with it, okay? You can open it a little bit and look at it, because if we can't see things, really, what good are they? But just want you to kind of see. Karen, would you? So I think that this is what she would then be using to spin her flax. Okay, so back to our manuscript, okay? All right, so this is what Mary said. And again, before my mother was married, remember, she had spun the flax and woven the linen, out of which she made all of her underclothes, sheets, and pillowcases. From the tow which she carded from the flax, she made bed ticks. Of course, she knit all of her own stockings, and the tablecloths that she made were said to be real beauties. And some of these she kept for many years, and I would be very proud to have one of them now. On March 22nd, 1827, the writer of this sketch, Mary Jane Branch, was born. This is her words. She was the 7th girl and the 9th child, all of whom were given life in this same old brown house mentioned before. I cannot think I was a very welcome visitor, but I was lovingly received and as tenderly cared for as parents with a large family and in limited circumstances could care for a child. My earliest recollections are somewhat dim, but I remember that in front of the old brown house stood 2 butternut trees, whose golden nuts came dropping down, and they were gathered and stored for the long winter evenings, which were enjoyed by the light of a big fireplace. For at this time, stoves of all kinds were unknown, and occasionally the brightness of a tallow candle. We had no matches, so we were very careful to not let our fire go out. In case it did, we had to go to the neighbors some distance away to borrow coals to rekindle. At the time of Victoria, Queen Victoria of England, by the time she was crowned, matches were exhibited, and as one of the wonders and sights of the world, they were something new and wonderful. And then she says, then there was the orchard, and in it was a cider mill. So cider was kept in our cellar all winter. It was a common thing to drink hard cider in those days, and I have heard my mother lament that many imbibed too freely. It was quite customary to pay the minister in cider. Thanksgiving was also strictly observed. The people had not yet forgotten the landing of the Pilgrims. I shall not forget the big chicken pie my mother used to make on these occasions, which were a great treat to us. Wheat bread was more of a novelty to us than cake is to most people in these days. Rye and Indian bread was our chief diet, but mush and milk and baked potatoes were the common dishes. I attribute my good health and strong digestion to a plain diet in my childhood. Now, this is me. Summarizing. When Mary was 5 years old, okay, all that was before she was 5. When she was 5 years old, they moved to Medina, Ohio. They were looking for richer farmland because where they lived in Massachusetts, the land was hard and granite. You've all seen pictures of the fences were made out of piles of rock that they took from the fields, and it was very, very difficult to raise a crop and to provide for this many children. So they left for Ohio. They first went to her grandfather's, her maternal grandfather's, Amherst Thompson's in Peru, Massachusetts, for a big farewell party. It was a great undertaking to go so far with a family of 11 when there were no railroads and they had no horses or no oxen. Her grandfather had a good team, so he took them as far as Albany, and with a tearful goodbye, as he was sure he would never see them again. From there, they took a canal boat to Buffalo. Often they would get out and walk along the towpath. Since the oldest sister, Emmeline, was left behind to finish a teaching contract, there were just 6 girls walking along, all in buff-colored dresses made by their mother. All were made from the same bolt of cloth that she had weaved. Mary supposed that the style did not show any great variety, but one day, while passing through a town, a grocery man took note of them walking along and said he'd never seen such a sight in his whole life. And he invited them to all come in for a treat. So little Mary remembered that. Another thing she remembered about this canal boat ride was that she would sing on the boat. She was a little over 5 years old. She had 2 famous songs in her repertoire. One was 3 Blind Mice, and the other one was Come Buy My Roses, Sweet Helen the Fair. And there was an old man on the boat for a while, and he would hire her to sing, and he would pay her with a peach, because he had a barrel of peaches in a nail keg. And peaches were really rare at that time. People just didn't have them, unless you were in Georgia probably. And she thought that they were the best thing that she had ever eaten. So, as they went along on this canal trip, as they were going west, they had intended to stop and spend the night with Elijah's brother. But due to cholera in the area, the boat was not allowed to land near there. So they had to go beyond, and they had to stay in a tavern overnight. And they had bread and milk for supper. And Mary said, why, I shall never forget having white bread. It seemed like a dish for a king. Okay, so they went along a little further, and if I remember right, they came to a cabin of a man whose wife had just died in childbirth. And so he was not well, he had a brand new baby, no wife, and so he asked them if they would live with him for a time and help him to get back on his feet and care for things. And it was close to the place where they had some land and they were going to build their cabin. So they stayed there as they built their cabin. And she talks about how her father, Mary talks about how her father and her brothers cut the logs and cleared the land. And they burnt the stumps, and finally they were able to build their cabin. They pulled a plow, and they carried things with a yoke upon their neck because they had no horse and they had no oxen. It was a full year after arriving in Ohio that they could even move into their cabin. But everyone worked, and eventually, working along, they were able to acquire a cow and a yoke of oxen. Then Mary wrote this: "We had a school, but we had to go through the very dense woods to reach it. My father, worried about us, blazed a trail on either side so that we could go and come without getting lost." And then she went on to explain that the log school was also the church, and that they often attended church and spelling school at night. And that her brothers would get long strips of hickory bark to make into torches. They would bind them together and they would light the ends. And she said those torches were better than any lantern you could ever have, even if they had had a lantern. So some of the days when they weren't in school, they would spend all day following the cows. They would follow the cows to dig up curcuma root, because it had, back then it was known for having a medicinal value. One cow in the herd would have a bell, and they always had to be able to hear that bell so that they could follow the cow home and not be lost. So when milking time came and the cows knew how to get back to be milked, they would just follow the cows home. When they got home, they would wash the roots and dry them, and they would be sold for a tiny bit of income for the family. She talked about hickory nuts. I loved hickory nuts because I remember my grandfather doing this. Hickory nuts were so plentiful, and they gathered one winter 100 bushel, and they sold them for 25 cents a bushel. Everyone did what they could to add to the meager supply of money. As the sisters became older, she had older sisters, as the sisters became older, they began to teach school. And then Mary wrote this: "My ever-industrious mother would spin and weave whenever the opportunity offered. She brought her little flax wheel with her from the old home way down east. But then, as soon as sheep were kept in Ohio, because they hadn't been before, as soon as sheep were kept in Ohio, she bought a loom and a wheel so that she could get the wheel to work, and she worked on shares with a farmer who provided her the wool. She remembered a man named Mr. Timothy Hudson, who let my mother have all the wool from several sheep. In this way, she clothed her family in flannels. There were no knit suits then, and if there had been, she would have had no money to buy them. Occasionally, she worked up the wool for money. At first, she had to card and spin it and then weave it, but later on there were carding mills, so she could get that done, and then she would only have to spin and weave." So this me again. As the family grew older, brothers and sisters were growing up, and as happens, they began to go their own ways. And Mary, in this manuscript, Mary looked back kind of regretfully, and you kind of saw her inner thinkings. And she said that she was kind of sorry because she didn't have to work as hard as her older sisters and brothers did. And because they had to work hard, they were more industrious. And they worked even harder, and they put themselves through college. But she was the youngest, and she hadn't really learned that very well, and she was so busy with life that she never really strove to do that. And so already she was regretting that. But when she was 16, she met a young man by the name of, whoops, let's go back to the front here. Sorry about this. She met a young man by the name of Garrett Spitzer. He actually came to their house to take her second oldest sister for a sleigh ride. She was very impressed to get to meet him, though she realized that that's all she was just kind of on the sideline. But she begged her mother to let her go with him because as he was going home, he was driving right by the home of one of her older sisters. So she begged her mother to let her ride that far with him and be dropped off. So she did that, and they got a little bit acquainted. Then the following year, Mary, remember she was 16, so maybe she was 17 by then, Mary taught school in Lafayette. And while she was teaching school, Mr. Spitzer visited the school and walked her home, leading the horse that he had ridden. She talked about him a little bit. He had grown up like she did, had to work very, very hard, was a farmer, had worked hard enough that he was able to buy some land of his own, and so he was quite an up-and-coming young man. Then Mary wrote, "When my school closed, he continued his attentions, and being a fine and handsome young man, I was not displeased thereby. He soon acknowledged that he wished to make me his wife, and after our acquaintance of about a year and a few months of courtship, we were married. He was now 27 years old, 6 foot tall and well proportioned, with very black hair and sharp black eyes, and high forehead, thin lips, and fair complexion. We were married on Thursday evening, November 21st, 1844, by a Mr. Fowler, and my sister Hannah being married at the same time." So she goes on for a page or two, describing the wedding and the dinner, very, very simple as you can imagine, but describing the wedding and the dinners and the parties that they had. And then she wrote this. Or not, you're right. One of those days, I'm sorry. So then she wrote, "We were far more stylish than many, for we had a fine carriage, with a door in it to ride into places of festivities, while everyone else had only a lumber wagon. On Sunday we attended church, still riding in our carriage. I confess I was proud of it, even if it was borrowed, for few had a chance to ride in a carriage then. By now, 4 days of merriment were over, and on Monday morning, we had to look at the stern realities. The first duty was to return the much-enjoyed carriage to its owner, and at once, Mr. Spitzer started to build us a house. Some lumber was ready, but the logs had to be prepared, so that 6 weeks elapsed before our home was ready for us, and a nice one we thought it was." So again, in the next few pages, Mary describes this in her, remember she's in her 90s by then, and she's remembering all this in such detail that it's amazing. But she remembers everything that was in her little house, because when she went to it for the first time, her mother-in-law was not far away, and they had provided in this little log cabin a cook stove, a high post bed, a table with 2 wood-bottomed chairs, 2 baking tins, and 1 tin cup. And that's what they had. No lamp, but some tallow candles, and Mother Spitzer had sent bread, pie, and cake, and potatoes, and meat to cook. Mary, had woolen sheets that her mother had woven. She said, "Thus, without being burdened with our possessions, we had comfort, and life was sweet and pleasant, and we eagerly planned and worked for the future." So she had such a good attitude. Mr. Spitzer, as she respectfully called him, had, like I said, worked hard to purchase this farm before they were married. And very slowly, you can see in the pages, very slowly they became more and more and more successful. so they had a little bit. But she talked also about the great setbacks that they suffered. In one case, the neighbors were trying to build a log crossing over a swampy area so that they could get to church. And they did this by laying logs, and they lay the logs this way and then this way, and then they would throw dirt over the logs to build up a road to go across this swamp. Well, Mr. Spitzer, being the good man that he was, offered his 2 oxen that he had just worked so hard to get to haul the dirt, as long as somebody else unloaded it all, because he was working in the fields. Well, it was a hot day in August, and one of the oxen died as a result. And that was a huge blow to their continued success. Another time she talked about was when they had saved and scrimped and finally been able to buy a 70-acre field, and they had planted it in some very fine wheat. And the wheat was beautiful, and they were looking forward to this great reward that they would get for all their labor and expense to plant it all. But in June, just as the wheat was heading, a severe frost killed it all. Another hard blow for the young farmers. Well, many other people in that area, she said, just gave up. That was kind of it for them. But as Mary said, not so with my energetic and persevering husband. He put horses and men to work immediately, and soon had those 70 acres planted with corn, a second crop, for which he received a fair crop price. So they realized something out of their loss. And then she goes on to talk about how in September of 1845, their first child, Alice, was born. And in 1847, another daughter, Evelyn. And then, I thought this was interesting, they took in a 6-year-old orphan. He lived with them until the Civil War broke out. Then he enlisted, and he was taken prisoner, and he was in Libbyville prison for a long time. When he finally came home, she described him as very much broken down in health, and she took care of him as best he could, but she said he died a few years later. Well, after that, remember they had Alice and Evelyn, then they had 3 boys, Amherst after her grandfather, Aaron and Adelbert. And Mr. Spitzer had to work very hard to provide for all of these children. He would do things like, he would kill hogs, and he would start out early in the night and walk to pulling a cart to get them to Cleveland to an early market so he could sell them. When Adelbert was the last boy born and was 1 year old, they finally moved from their little log house into a larger one on a farm half a mile to the south that they got. Then in 1859, their 3rd daughter was born, the 3rd generation that we're going to talk about by and by, Francelia. Alice went off to Oberlin College. She made her own way, she earned her own money, because she had learned to be very diligent, to have a great work ethic. As the children began to go off and they were getting to be better and better along, they were able to buy their first carriage. A 2-seated one, she said, for $175.
Whoa.
So you can see that they had setbacks, but they kept pressing forward, and little by little, they were making it. So now again in Mary's words. In 1862, March 10th, another daughter was born to us. We named her Louette. Now just before this, 1862, just before this, the Civil War had broken out. There was great excitement everywhere. My husband at this time was 45 years old, but he did not go to war. And although he was not required to do so, he hired a man to go for him. He rendered too much valuable service to his country while at home. He had charge of the fund that was raised to help the needy wives and children of the soldiers at the front, and he paid liberally himself for this purpose. During the war, help to do farm work was very scarce and very, very expensive, so they had to work extra hard. But she did say that what farmers had to sell bought a great price as well. Okay, so Francelia then was born in Medina, Ohio, July 3rd, 1859, as we said. She was the 6th in this family of 3 sons and 5 daughters. In 1879, she graduated from Oberlin College and came to Wyoming, Iowa to visit a sister. That sister had married Captain Loomis of the Civil War. So she just happened to come back our way. And through the influence of this captain, who made application in her name, she was elected to a position in the Maquoketa High School. And she taught Latin here from 1880 to 1882. And on October 11th, 1883, she married Dr. Luce. And they lived their entire lives in Maquoketa. So the Luces, as you know, live in the beautiful house in the historic district where Chris Nissen lives now. He was probably the most well-trained of all of our early doctors and surgeons, because he was constantly going away, sometimes even to Europe, to further his schooling and that sort of thing. They did great things here, just as a little forerunner to the last half of our program next time. They did wonderful things here. They did great things for the library, did they not, Karen? They were huge supporters. He had envisioned this piece of land where the library stands today. He had envisioned that long before as being a place to build a library. So he purchased that piece of land. And though the library board did buy that back from him, he didn't donate it, they bought it back from him, but he had long ago picked out and saved that choice lot so that Maquoketa could have a library in 1904. They were both he and his wife, Francilia, were great supporters of the library. He made many donations over time. One was for a book fund, and Karen, maybe you know about this. One was for a book fund. It was kind of a revolving fund, as I understand, where the library could use it to buy reference books and things as they became available, so that they could continue to That's telling me it's time to quit. So that they could have books for the library. Another thing that Dr. Luce did, he was one of the first people to start work to get a hospital built in Maquoketa. He died, I believe, in 1952, but he did much work towards seeing that Jackson County had a public hospital. They were wonderful people, they did wonderful things. I'm just saying, the kind of people that maybe belong in our Hall of Fame, if somebody ever nominated them. They had no children, but someday, somebody will nominate them. Anyway, in 3 weeks, we'll talk about the rest of the story, the third generation, which is Dr. Luce and his wife, Francilia, and all of the wonderful things that they did for early Maquoketa. So I just am so happy that Karen Manning is here today. I think it's so wonderful. The library had this manuscript for we don't know how many years. They had this wonderful original manuscript. They took such good care of it, and then they donated it to us. Hopefully we'll also take such good care of it. But if you ever have time, come by and just read it, because I just picked out a few of the little stories. It's full of wonderful, wonderful things.
I do have
Karen,
one thing to say.
Thank you.
If you're ever interested, go to the history room in the public library. I'm sure that some of the books that look really old will have a nameplate inside, donated by or in the memory of Dr. and Francilia is spelled out, which is a little unusual for that generation, because there's a bunch of women who were very active in getting the library organized at the turn of the century, who are only known to his history by their husbands' names.
And that's the way it was, huh? Thank you for that. So anyway, I didn't want this just to smolder away in a file cabinet somewhere. So now you know that we have it, so please come in. Any questions? Any comments? Yes.
I want to mention, my kids have noticed the style, the architecture of the library.
Yes.
It's Carnegie, is that correct?
It is.
And there aren't that many of them. Yeah, they were.
There's about 100 actually in Iowa.
Is there really?
But many of them now have been.
Yes, many of them are gone.
Yeah.
Right. And to add to that, I would like to say, during all the time that I was gone, which was a lot of time, there was a beautiful original library, the Carnegie Library, because they furnished the money for the building. And then inside was the Boardman Reference Library that Karen talked about. But the library board did a beautiful job of the addition that they put on. I mean, when I heard that they were doing that, and I was who knows where, I thought, oh yeah, they're going to ruin this library. But when I came back and saw how artfully it had been added to, it's wonderful. They deserve so much credit. So.
Well, this was partly because of what we understood as community sentiment. When we were talking about the need for more space in the library, almost everybody that we consulted said, oh, we have to keep the original library. It was not a question that it would be abandoned and we'd have a library somewhere else. So that was one, when we were choosing an architect, that was the very, very top of our mind, someone who's sensitive to the beauty and integrity of the present building and would add on in a way that would enhance it rather than spoil it.
And that's a wonderful thing. So when we have part 2, we have some very, very old pictures of the library when it was first built. And you'll be able to see those and how it's pretty much stayed the same. So anyway, thank you very much.